If you're always available, you're easily replaceable. Modern workplaces reward availability publicly, but privately, they often exploit it. Most people grow up believing that being dependable, responsive, and endlessly accessible will make them respected. They answer every message immediately, volunteer for extra work, stay emotionally available for everyone around them, and sacrifice boundaries in the hope of becoming indispensable. But human psychology rarely works that way. In reality, excessive availability often lowers perceived value. The more predictable and emotionally accessible someone becomes, the less psychological tension they create. And without tension, there is no intrigue, no scarcity, and eventually, no appreciation. This dynamic appears everywhere: workplaces, friendships, relationships, and even social hierarchies. The employee who is always willing to help becomes invisible. The friend who is always present becomes emotionally overlooked. The person who never says no slowly loses authority. This isn't because people are evil. It's because the human brain instinctively values what feels limited, difficult to access, or emotionally uncertain. Scarcity creates perceived importance. Constant access destroys it. In workplace environments specifically, hyperavailability often signals low leverage. Managers unconsciously prioritize employees who appear harder to replace, emotionally independent, and less desperate for approval. The tragedy is that many hardworking people confuse self-sacrifice with power. But power usually comes from controlled access, emotional discipline, and strategic boundaries. The central idea behind "if you're always available, you're easily replaceable" is not about becoming cold or manipulative. It's about understanding how perceived value is psychologically created. Because in a world driven by attention, emotional scarcity, and social hierarchy, people rarely protect what they believe will always be there. If you're always available, you're easily replaceable. Dark office hallway. Fluorescent lights flickering. Phone notifications rapidly appearing on screen. The people who answer immediately usually get respected the least. The employee who never says no is often the first person people stop valuing. And the person who is always emotionally available, they slowly become invisible. Because human psychology has a dark contradiction. The more accessible you become, the less people fear losing you. And when nobody fears losing you, you become replaceable. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the most respected people are usually the hardest to access. Watch till the end. You probably believed availability was a strength. Answer quickly. Work harder. Be dependable. Be supportive. Always show up. That's what they taught you. And at first, it works. People praise you. They call you reliable, helpful, loyal. But something strange begins happening over time. The appreciation fades. Your effort becomes expected. Your presence becomes normal. And eventually, invisible. Nobody notices how much you sacrifice anymore. Because psychologically, humans adapt very quickly to constant access. What was once valuable becomes ordinary. Human beings are wired to value scarcity, not abundance. Scarcity creates tension, curiosity, attention, importance. This is why rare things feel expensive. Why unavailable people feel intriguing. Why silence feels powerful. And this psychological rule applies to people just as much as objects. If someone always has access to you, your attention loses weight. Your time loses status. Your presence becomes psychologically predictable. And predictability is dangerous. Because predictable people are emotionally easy to replace. The modern workplace secretly rewards emotional distance, not emotional exhaustion. The employee who constantly stays late is rarely seen as powerful. They are seen as available. And availability changes perception. Managers unconsciously think they'll always be here. So they prioritize people who appear harder to access. The employee with boundaries. The one whose time feels structured. The one who doesn't emotionally chase approval. Because psychologically, People respect what appears selective, not desperate. There were two employees, Daniel and Marcus. Daniel answered emails instantly, volunteered constantly, never rejected extra work, stayed late every night. Marcus didn't. He worked hard, but he left on time, protected his schedule, spoke less, and never looked emotionally desperate to impress anyone. Daniel believed effort alone would make him irreplaceable. Marcus understood perception. Months later, Daniel was exhausted, invisible, overloaded. Marcus got promoted, and Daniel couldn't understand why. But management already saw Daniel as permanent background noise. Always available, always accessible, always predictable. His sacrifice stopped looking valuable. It started looking expected. Meanwhile, Marcus created psychological scarcity. His time felt important, so people treated it that way. Overavailability doesn't just damage your workplace value. It destroys social leverage. People unconsciously test emotional access. The faster you respond, the more emotionally dependent you appear. The more you over-explain, the weaker your silence becomes. The more you constantly show up, the less your presence affects anyone. And eventually people stop asking, how valuable are they? And start assuming, they'll always be there. That assumption is dangerous, because humans rarely protect what feels permanently available. Notice something strange. The people everyone chases are usually not the most available. They are the most selective. Not because they hate people, but because selective access creates perceived status. This is why limited invitations feel important, delayed responses feel powerful, quiet people appear confident, busy people appear valuable. Scarcity manipulates attention, and attention controls social power. The human brain interprets difficulty as importance, which means constant accessibility accidentally communicates the opposite. Replaceability begins psychologically long before it becomes practical. People don't replace you the moment someone better appears. They replace you the moment your absence stops mattering. That's the real danger. If your presence creates no emotional contrast, there is no emotional impact. And if there is no emotional impact, there is no perceived loss. That's why emotionally overavailable people often feel shocked when they are ignored. They gave everything, but constant giving removes all rarity from their presence. Some people consciously exploit this. Others do it unconsciously. But the pattern is the same. The more available you become, the more demands increase. Why? Because humans naturally expand into accessible space. If you answer work messages at midnight once, people slowly normalize it. If you constantly rescue others emotionally, people begin expecting emotional labor from you. And once expectation replaces appreciation, resentment begins. This is how burnout starts. Not through one big moment, but through thousands of tiny acts of unprotected availability. Absence creates awareness. Humans notice contrast, not consistency. When you disappear briefly, people suddenly recognize the emotional weight you carried. This is why vacations expose dysfunctional workplaces. Suddenly everyone realizes who solved problems, who carried conversations, who stabilized emotions, who handled chaos. But if you never disappear, nobody notices your value, because psychologically, you became part of the background. Most people struggle with boundaries because they confuse availability with worth. Saying no creates guilt. Delayed replies create anxiety. Silence feels rude. But that discomfort reveals something important. You were conditioned to earn value through constant accessibility. And the moment you stop overgiving, you fear rejection. But powerful people understand something most never learn. Boundaries don't reduce respect. They filter it. The most dangerous habit is emotional overcompliance. Always adapting. Always accommodating. Always available. Because over time, you stop becoming a person and start becoming a convenience. Convenience is useful, but rarely respected. And once people psychologically categorize you as endlessly accessible, reversing that perception becomes difficult. That's why controlled availability matters. Not to manipulate others, but to protect your psychological value. So how do you change this? First, stop rewarding instant access. Not every message deserves immediate attention. Second, protect your schedule. People respect structured time more than endless flexibility. Third, learn strategic silence. You don't need to explain every decision. Fourth, detach from approval addiction. The need to constantly prove usefulness destroys authority. And finally, create emotional independence. People value those who appear grounded without external validation. Respect rarely comes from giving people unlimited access. It comes from controlled presence. Notice how powerful people behave. They aren't emotionally frantic. They don't over-explain. They don't constantly chase attention. Their energy feels measured, selective, intentional, because psychologically, restraint creates gravity, and gravity creates influence. Meanwhile, desperation creates noise, and noise gets ignored. Person leaving office alone at night. City lights reflecting in rain. You were never meant to be endlessly accessible. Not to employers, not to friends, not to people who only value convenience. Your time is not infinite. Your attention is not cheap. And your emotional energy should not be permanently available to everyone. Because the harsh reality is this. People often appreciate you the least when you make access effortless. But the moment your absence becomes noticeable, your value becomes real. Key lessons. 1. Scarcity creates value. People unconsciously value what feels limited. Constant availability removes psychological tension and lowers perceived importance. 2. Boundaries signal self-respect. When you constantly sacrifice your time and energy, people assume your time has little value. Boundaries communicate confidence and self-worth. 3. Overgiving can reduce respect. Doing too much for others often creates comfort, not admiration. Familiarity without limits eventually weakens authority. 4. Emotional independence increases influence. People who are emotionally grounded and not constantly seeking approval naturally appear more powerful. 5. Immediate access weakens presence. Always replying instantly, always saying yes, and always being available conditions others to see you as predictable rather than valuable. 6. Strategic distance builds curiosity. A small amount of unpredictability increases intrigue, attention, and respect. 7. The workplace rewards perceived leverage. Employees who appear emotionally dependent on validation are often overlooked compared to those who project calm independence. 8. Respect is not earned through exhaustion. Being overworked does not automatically create importance. Visibility and positioning matter more than endless sacrifice. 9. Silence can be more powerful than explanation. Not every message requires an immediate response. Calm restraint often communicates more authority than over-explaining. 10. Your presence must have weight. If people never experience your absence, they stop recognizing your value. Average people try to become useful to everyone. Powerful people become selective with their presence. Never make your loyalty so automatic that your absence means nothing. Because if you're always available, you become easily replaceable. Protect your value. Humans don't value constant access. Managers unconsciously reward emotional distance. People only notice your value when you disappear. And remember, your guilt is conditioning.